If you looked into a big recording studio in the 80s or in the 90s, then there's a pretty decent chance that you saw one of these big SSL consoles. And in the master section of those consoles, there was a master bus compressor. And this compressor was used on countless of hit records. You have probably heard it, and you will recognize the character of it once you have learned the sound of it. And the design became very popular, and nowadays there are lots of different options if you want that kind of compression, both in hardware and as software plugins. And one of these plugins is the Glue from Cytomic. And this is one of the few analog modeled plugins that I regularly use when I'm mastering. And in this video, we will have a look at bus compression in general, and then we will dive deep into the Glue compressor. And I will also give you my exact strategy for how I am using the Glue compressor when I'm mastering. My name is Thomas, and I have been working with mastering for more than 20 years now. I run a mastering company together with Sofia, and on this channel we try to give out information that can be useful for you if you are into music production. In the grand scheme of things, there are basically two ways that you can use a bus compressor. You can either use it while you are mixing and then mix into the compressor and make adjustments to the mix depending on how the compressor reacts. In this way, you will incorporate the sound of the compressor into the sound of the mix already while you are mixing. And you can often let the compressor work a lot more in this way and leave a bigger imprint on the sound of the mix. And if you hear a great sounding recording with lots of audible compression that also sounds musical, then they have probably done it in this way. They have used compression on the mix bus already while mixing. The other way to use bus compression is to use it on the finished mix after the fact, so to speak. And that's what we do when we are mastering. The difference here is that there is no way to adjust the mix to counteract any bad things that the compressor is doing. So it will be more difficult to get a lot of character from the compression without also changing the overall dynamics of the mix, and to some extent also the balances within the mix. And sometimes the mix will benefit from reducing the dynamics, but I find that most of the time I want to keep the dynamics of the mix as much as possible. Modern mixes tend to be quite compressed already, and I don't want to add to that compression and reduce the dynamics further. So when I'm mastering, I tend to use a small amount of gain reduction, usually around half a dB or maybe up to 1 dB, but very rarely more than that. So a good compressor for me is one that will give me a lot of character from that small amount of gain reduction. And the Glue is one of these kinds of compressors. You can get a lot of character even at small amounts of gain reduction, and that's what I like about it. So let's have a look at the features of the Glue. So the Glue is a pretty standard compressor when it comes to the interface and the features. You have the usual controls, you have the threshold and the attack and the ratio and the release, and also a makeup gain. These work just as you would expect them to work in a normal compressor. And one thing to note about the ratio is that it also controls the knee of the compressor. So you have a wider knee at 2 to 1, and you have a sharper knee at 10 to 1, and a medium-sized knee at 4 to 1. And at the top of the GUI, you have the gain reduction meter. And here you can see how much the compressor is working at the moment. And the range knob, this is a feature that is not very common in a compressor, but this will let you set how much the compressor should be able to compress at most. So if I put it at minus 8 dB, then the compression will be limited to maximum 8 dBs of gain reduction. So this is a feature that you can use instead of using mixing, for example. You can limit the amount of gain reduction that the compressor should be able to do. I don't use this feature that much, but I would guess that it's useful for certain situations. And the attack and the release works pretty much as you would expect. Shorter attack times will squash the transients more, and longer attack times will let the transients through. So with this, you can pretty much decide how thick you want the transients to be. And for mastering a full mix, I will usually use one of the top 3 timings. Occasionally I will use 1 milliseconds, but my favorite setting is 10 milliseconds. That tends to work most of the time. And the release setting is quite standard as well. The one exception is the A mode, the auto mode, and this works pretty much as most kinds of automatic releases. You will have a short release for short transients, and you will have a longer release for longer periods of gain reduction. And this auto mode is probably most usable when you are mixing into the compressor, when you're using the compressor already while mixing. I don't find very much use of it when mastering, because it tends to sometimes get stuck at a reduced gain, and then you get a sort of wavering effect on the full mix, and I don't quite like that. I generally tend to be on the shorter side of things when I'm using this for mastering. The next parameter is the compressor in button, and this is just a bypass for the compressor, so you can easily switch on and off. And the difference between using this button and using the global bypass of the compressor is that when disabling the compression in this way, then the signal will still go through the compressor, but it will remove the gain reduction and it will remove the makeup gain. So it will still pass through some circuitry within the plugin, for example, the peak clip. I will talk about that in a while. But I rarely use this button. The mix control will let you decide how much of the dry signal you want in the signal. You can blend between the dry and the compressed signal. So this is a feature that you will find in many plugins nowadays. You can do this parallel style of compression, additive compression, or New York style compression, or whatever it's called. And if you're a Reaper user, then you can use this button at the top of the plugin and get pretty much the same effect. The next button is the peak clip, and this is a soft clipper that will begin to clip at -2 dBs, and it will hard clip at -0.5 dB fs. I don't use it that much, but if you use it, you can see that it will light up this light when it is clipping. But I don't use it that much. And at the bottom of the plugin, you have some sidechain features. This is a sidechain high-pass filter. So this will remove low end from the signal that the compressor sees and reacts to. So if you, for example, have a loud and deep kick drum in your mix and you don't want the compressor to react to that kick drum too much, then you can use the high-pass filter to filter some of that energy out of the signal that the compressor sees. And I find that it's very useful if the compressor is reacting too much to the low end, then I will just increase this a bit. But for the most cases, I will just leave it off. You can also input an external sidechain into the compressor by pressing this button, and then you will be able to input an external signal to be used as a sidechain. And this can, for example, be useful if you want the compressor to trigger on the kick drum, for example. Then you can route the kick drum into the sidechain and let the compressor react to that when you are mixing. So those are the main features of the compressor. It's very straightforward. If you want to reset any of the controls to the default position, then you just hold Alt and click, and then the control will reset to the default setting. Up on the top of the screen, there are some options as well. You have an A/B function, and then you can, for example, have one setting in A and copy that to B, and then you can have another setting here, for example, and then you can switch between those two settings. This is also quite a common feature in many plugins nowadays, and it's quite useful if you're trying out different things. And this is where you set the oversampling of the plugin. And what this does is that you can tweak the inner workings of the compressor, because all kinds of dynamic processing or non-linear processing in the digital domain will usually require some sort of upsampling or oversampling in order to do things while also sounding clean. And many plugins just hide this setting behind the scenes and use whatever setting that the plugin designer thinks is appropriate for the processing. But in this plugin, then you can choose this by yourself, and there are two settings, either the real-time or the render setting. And the difference between these two is that if the host allows it, then the plugin will use different settings for playback and for rendering. So the reasoning is that you can use less CPU when you are listening, when you are playing back the material, and then use a higher quality setting when you are actually rendering out the final result. I don't hear that much difference between the different settings, but if I change it, I will usually set the real time to 8x8 as well, so that the render and the real time is the same setting. I prefer to hear the final result already while I'm tweaking, but at the same time I don't hear that much difference between these settings. But in my template setup I have this set to 8 for both real time and rendering. And these settings I just leave at default. So I mentioned in the intro that this is one of the few analog modeled plugins that I use when I'm mastering, and I like how it shapes the transients, and I tend to use it mostly for that kind of coloration. I think it's especially good at making the kick and snare in a modern mix to be slightly more pronounced, especially in the upper mids, without adding harshness. It's a quite recognizable sound that I've heard it on lots of records, and I think when there comes a mix that this kind of sound fits to, then I will reach for this plugin to get that sort of sound. I don't use it that much for actually compressing, as in reducing the dynamics. But that's mostly because most mixes tend to be compressed enough when I receive them, and it tends to add more of this transient enhancing character the more you compress as well. So for some mixes that is suitable, but sometimes it can be a bit too much unless it really fits the sound of the mix. And the way I use the glue is very simple. I generally leave it at the default settings. I will set the attack to 10 milliseconds and I will set the release to the shortest setting. And then I will adjust the threshold so that the meters just start to move. I just want a slight bounce of the meter. I'm aiming for maybe half a dB or up to 1 dB of gain reduction. That's usually where I aim for. And I will not use the makeup gain. I almost never use the makeup gain on a compressor when I'm using it in this way. Because I think a compressor, when you use it in this way, then the compressor should make the mix sound better without any makeup gain. That's a rule of thumb. And that's it really. It will either make the mix sound better or worse. And I might try some different attack times, usually 3 milliseconds or 30 milliseconds, depending on what kind of effect that I want on the transients. But this is the general strategy that I use. And I think the most important part of it is that I avoid the makeup gain. Because if I'm not using the makeup gain, then I can also avoid being fooled by the loudness bias when I'm turning the compressor on and off. If anything, it will give the loudness advantage to the bypassed version. And that's generally a good thing, because I think a compressor should do a great job without adding any gain. It should still sound better, although it's slightly quieter. But since I'm using very small amounts of gain reduction, then the difference will be very small anyway. So it's more or less the same loudness. And the difference between switching on and off with this kind of settings are very small. It's subtle. You need to hear it in context, and you will need to listen to the mix and make a decision. Does it sound better or does it sound worse? And mastering is a lot about adding the right kind of small changes that will add up to a big improvement of the mix. And using this method makes it very easy to decide, does it sound better or does it sound worse? If it sounds worse, I will not use the compressor, or I will try some different settings maybe, but unless I like the sound, then I will not use the compressor. Simple as that. And if you want some more tips on how to use plugins for mastering, then I suggest that you get our free PDF, 5 mastering strategies using free plugins. There you will get some great strategies that both me and Sofia use all the time when we are mastering, as well as some tips on free plugins that I think you should get if you haven't already. They're really useful. You will find the link in the description and also on the screen right now. So that's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it and that you got something useful out of it. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.